Hello everyone and welcome to the Hockey Hub. We're doing another team preview today and we're looking at the Minnesota Wild. Now the Minnesota Wild has been one of the most mediocre teams in the NHL for the past couple seasons, and I'm not sure if that's bound to change. They did actually have a big offseason, getting a new GM who ended up making a lot of moves, which kind of surprised me because a lot of times we see a newer GM in the league. He tends to, kind of take things easy, but he decided to really change up the makeup of the roster this offseason. So we're going to get into what they added. Now, to start off, I don't normally include rookies when it comes to, the additions, but I think in this case I have to. Kirill Kaprizov is one of the most highly touted prospects in the NHL, and he's finally come over from the KHL and is definitely going to make his NHL debut this upcoming season. If Kaprizov is the real deal, this could really change, the way that the Minnesota Wild franchise is viewed. He's a potential, possibly franchise player, player that's been compared to Artemi Panarin. So there is very high expectations for Kaprizov. I don't know if he's going to be the next Artemi Panarin, but I definitely expect him to be a top-line forward with all the hype around him. And then there's Marco Rossi as well. Marco Rossi was kind of a steal for the Minnesota Wild, and he could end up playing on their team this upcoming season. Scouts have said that he's physically ready for the NHL, so I have reason to believe that I think he actually is going to play for the Minnesota Wild. Now, the Minnesota Wild also signed goaltender Cam Talbot in free agency. I'm not sure how I feel about this move, as I don't think that Cam Talbot is a bona fide starter in the NHL. I think he's best suited as a backup or kind of a 1B goaltender. He did look very good for Calgary in the playoffs, but that was just kind of one run, and I don't know if he can bear the load of a starter. They also traded for Nick Bjugstad. They didn't really have to give up much at all for him, and Pittsburgh didn't end up retaining any salary. Nick Bjugstad has really struggled with injury these past couple seasons, and I don't really see him as much more than maybe a bottom six center at this point. Maybe he's able to play the third line there in Minnesota, but I don't have any expectations of him playing in the top six for them. Probably fourth line realistically. They also traded for Nick Bonino, who I do think probably fits in as maybe the second line or maybe third line center there. Bonino is a very solid two-way forward. He was a big part of Pittsburgh's back-to-back Stanley Cup wins and is kind of an underrated player in the NHL. They also traded for Marcus Johansson, which that move I don't really get from the Minnesota side. Sending away Eric Stahl and getting back Johansson just doesn't seem like fair value, and apparently they have aspirations of playing Johansson at center, which I do not feel is the best position for Johansson. To me, he's a natural winger, and whenever he's been tried at center, it hasn't really worked out for his offensive totals, and he's a guy that you expect to provide offense. Now, Minnesota really traded away a lot this offseason. They traded away Eric Stahl, who's been a very key guy for them these past couple seasons. He even had 40 goals a couple years ago and has been a very good member of the Minnesota Wild, so he's a player they decided to move on from. They let their captain Mikko Koivu walk, who's played his entire career there, so it's kind of a shame that he's going to be playing in a different uniform. I honestly thought that he might have retired if Minnesota had decided not to re-sign him, but that wasn't the case. He ended up signing in Columbus. They also traded away Devan Dubnyk to the San Jose Sharks. Dubnyk has been a very good starter for them, but these past few years hasn't exactly been the case. Dubnyk's game has really fell off, and he was frankly quite brutal this past season. 3 or 4 years ago, he looked like one of the best goaltenders in the NHL, but that simply isn't the case anymore. They also traded away Ryan Donato to the San Jose Sharks, and this is a move that's kind of baffled me. Donato didn't have the best season in Minnesota, but there's definitely a lot of potential there, and the fact that they only got back a third-round draft pick for him just doesn't seem like fair value, so I'm not a big fan of that move, especially when they're trying to work on their center position, and Donato is a decent enough young centerman. They traded away Luke Kunin, who does have some potential. They ended up trading him for Nick Bonino, who I previously talked about. Kunin kind of projects as a middle six winger. He is a bit bigger, so there is some value there in losing him. I think their lineup is going to kind of miss him a bit. They also let JT Brown walk in free agency. Kind of a depth guy, not really a big deal there. And they let Alex Galchenyuk walk in free agency as well. This kind of surprised me. I thought they were actually probably going to re-sign Galchenyuk, since Galchenyuk didn't look bad in the few games he played for them. I know in the return to play he was kind of invisible, but in the regular season it kind of looked like Galchenyuk might have finally found a home in Minnesota. He did play decent there, but they elected not to re-sign him. Now, Minnesota's top six really depends on the emergence of Kirill Kaprizov. I do have him in the top six because I think he's going to be given every opportunity to break out, so I would definitely say he's a top six player. Kevin Fiala is a very underrated forward and looked like a star this past season. He put up very good offensive totals, and in the return to play, he was easily Minnesota's most dangerous player. Fiala's one of those guys that, if you watch him play, you can tell he's got a lot of talent. And despite the fact that he struggled his first year in Minnesota, he really had a breakout year this past year and does look like their best overall forward. Zach Parise is still in Minnesota. There was some rumors that he was going to get moved at the deadline, but that didn't end up happening. Parise is still a solid player for his age, but he's definitely declining, and for that contract, he would be a very hard piece to move. But overall, he can still provide some solid offense for that team. Matt Zuccarello is a guy they brought in from free agency a year ago. Now, Zuccarello apparently is not going to be ready for about the first month or so of the season, so that is a big loss for the Minnesota Wild. He's a guy that's counted upon to bring offense, and him out of the lineup is seriously going to hurt their forward depth. They did bring in Marcus Johansson, who I envision plays a top 6 role for them, whether it's at wing or center. Johansson is a solid middle 6 winger. I don't think he's best suited at center, like I said, but I think he can still provide you with about 50 points over an 82-game schedule. And then I guess for the last guy, I would have Joel Eriksson-Ek in here. Now, there is a lot of expectations for Eriksson-Ek to have a breakout season. He was a first-round draft pick, 20th overall, and actually did have his career best year. He projects as a two-way center, and I think he does have a lot of potential on that side of the game. I remember against Montreal, he ended up blocking, I think it was 3 Shea Weber slap shots in a row, so he plays with a lot of heart, and I do think has potential to be a good two-way center in a middle 6 role. Now, Minnesota actually has one of the best top 4s in the NHL, in my opinion. Ryan Suter is still a very solid defender for his age, and in my opinion is probably the best pick to fill the captaincy there. Jared Spurgeon is a very good defenseman as well. For a lot of people, it depends on where you stand on Jared Spurgeon. Some people either overrate him, specifically the analytics community thinks that Jared Spurgeon is a top 5 defenseman in the NHL. I think that's pushing it a bit. But then there's people that really don't pay attention and don't realize how good of a defenseman he actually is. I think he is a top pairing guy in my opinion. I really like his overall game, and for a smaller defenseman, he's quite good. The problem I have with Spurgeon is that contract is very big, and for his age and his size, I don't know if he's going to be able to play up to that standard. Matthew Dumba is another guy with a lot of potential and is already a solid top 4 blue liner for them as well. Dumba was quite good these past few seasons, but he has struggled with injury. And then there's Jonas Brodin, who they gave a big contract to as well. Brodin is one of the best defensive defensemen in the NHL, so I definitely think he's worth what he's getting paid, but I think they gave up a lot in term, in my opinion. But for now, Brodin is still a very solid defensive defender, and overall, their top 4 is really, really good. Now, I think goaltending is probably the weak spot of the Minnesota lineup. Cam Talbot is a good goaltender, but like I said previously, I don't envision him as a starter in the NHL. If he can get back to the form we saw in Edmonton for the 2016-2017 season, well, then that would change a lot of things. But I don't think he's that player anymore. He is getting older. He's 33, and while that isn't necessarily old for a goaltender, because goaltenders can play well into their late 40s, I don't think that, or not late 40s, late 30s, sorry. But I don't think that Talbot is a guy who's going to be a star goaltender for the next few years, and I don't even think he's a starting goaltender right now. Alex Stalock is their backup, and he had a very good season this past year. He did kind of take over as the starter for Minnesota and did start for them in the play-in round, but he wasn't that great in the play-in round. He didn't even have a save percentage above 900. So the duo of Talbot and Stalock isn't one of the best in the NHL. I would say it's probably a top 10 worst tandem, but if Talbot can bounce back to his previous forms, then maybe it looks a little better than it does, but right now I really don't see a bona fide starter there. Now, when it comes to Minnesota's best players, most of their best players are their defensemen. I would say that Suter, Spurgeon, and Dumba do make up some of these best players. I was going to put Brodin in here, but I did decide to put Fiala and Parise over Brodin at the moment. I do think that as Parise continues to regress, I do think Brodin will make his way into this top 4, but it's going to be interesting to see what they do with the Seattle draft coming up. They could be a team that decides to protect 4 defensemen and 4 forwards instead of the usual format, and it wouldn't surprise me if they did. The reason why we're seeing so many Matt Dumba trade rumors is because of the whole Seattle expansion thing. We don't really see a lot of rumors involving Spurgeon or Brodin or Suter because they've all got very expensive long-term contracts. But since Dumba is, he's not necessarily locked up that long a term, and his contract actually looks pretty reasonable for what he provides, and he's the youngest of them all, that makes him an easy candidate for Seattle to pick if they end up going with the whole, the usual protect 3 defensemen thing. I'm not sure if Minnesota would still choose to protect Dumba. They are very big on Brodin. They did just give him that contract. So it does make sense why Dumba's in trade rumors, but I think it probably just makes more sense to protect 4 defensemen, especially when you consider the lack of forward depth they have. I don't think they have to protect Kaprizov, and he could very well end up being their best player as soon as next season. But for now, I would say that their best players, most of them, are their defensemen. Now, going into their interesting players. As I previously mentioned, Matthew Dumba is probably the most interesting piece for them right now. I could see him getting traded, but at the same time, I do think he has a lot of potential. He's already a very good defenseman, and when you look at their forward depth, it kind of just makes more sense to hold on to him. I'm not sure if Dumba is going to be a top pairing guy at any point, but I think if he was playing bigger minutes on a team that didn't have as much defensive depth as Minnesota, so I think a team like Vancouver could be a good fit for an example. So it's going to be interesting to see what Minnesota decides to do with Matthew Dumba. And I want to talk about Joel Eriksson-Ek again, because I do think he actually does have a lot of potential. I really like his overall game, and even though his offensive totals aren't that big, I think he could be a very good under-the-radar player, kind of think like a Nick Bonino, who they have on their team. His two-way game is very solid, and he plays with a lot of heart. But the question I have with Eriksson-Ek is, if Minnesota decides to protect 4 defensemen in the upcoming Seattle expansion draft, that would probably end up leaving Eriksson-Ek exposed, and I think that could be an easy pick for Seattle. And if he ends up being picked, and then he has a big season in Seattle, that really wouldn't reflect well on Minnesota's management. So I do think that Eriksson-Ek is a piece that Minnesota needs to figure out a way how to keep with the expansion draft coming up. But I also want to talk about Marco Rossi. And Rossi is another player that could really change the fate of Minnesota this upcoming season. If Rossi and Kaprizov can be 2 of the best rookies in the NHL, then Minnesota is actually going to have a very good core and could end up actually making the playoffs. Rossi is said to be physically ready for the NHL and that he doesn't necessarily have a lot of room to grow. So that's probably part of the reason why he put up such high offensive totals in the OHL and yet wasn't drafted as high as maybe you'd expect for putting up those numbers, because it's said that he's already physically mature. So if he is, I don't think there's any reason why he shouldn't crack the Minnesota lineup, especially when you consider their lack of center depth. I think that Rossi probably ends up playing a top 6 role for them if he's able to make the roster. Now, I'd say that the Minnesota Wild are a bubble team. To me, they're kind of still stuck in that mediocrity. It really depends on how Kaprizov and Rossi perform. If those guys can come in and look like stars, then that's really going to change things. But right now, if you look at their overall roster, I don't think their goaltending is good enough to be a contender. I do really like their defense and a few of their forwards like Kevin Fiala. But that being said, I don't think that they have the star power to be a true contender, especially not a cup favorite. But I also don't think that they're bad enough to be a rebuilder either, and this has kind of been the story of the Minnesota Wild for what feels like a very long time. Not good enough to tank and get a high draft pick, but also not good enough to be a cup threat. They could very well make the playoffs, especially if they're playing in a weaker division with the whole realignment thing, but I'm not sure, so that's why I would have them as a bubble team. But that does it for today's video. I appreciate you guys watching till the end. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys later. Bye for now.